So thank you so much again. Thank you, Ted, for your time, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay. First off, can everyone hear me okay? Little thumbs up or nod.
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you again, Crystal, for having me. Super excited to be here tonight. As she mentioned, my name is Ted Rosen. I am the Director of Operations for Dixon's Farm Stand Meats. We're a butcher shop in the city and have been around for about 12 years now. I started working there in 2011, then went off to do a couple other things, and now am back kind of running the whole operation from prepared foods to butchering to wholesale. I do a little bit of everything. So tonight we're going to talk about meat, obviously. So tonight, what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about what is, good meat. Everyone always asks me, what's the best cut? What's your favorite cut? What's good for this? What's good for that? And we'll learn pretty quickly that it's sort of a subjective thing. There isn't really one way to identify what is good meat, what is bad meat. And then we'll get into anatomy a little bit. We'll talk about some of the cuts that you find. Tonight we'll probably be speaking mostly in terms of beef, but you can pretty much use a lot of the terminology and a lot of the ideas that we talk about with other cuts, especially pork, lamb, bison, venison, those kinds of things. We'll talk a little bit about poultry as well. Then we'll talk quickly about how to eat meat, best ways for cooking things, and then we'll sort of wrap up with any questions that anyone might have. As Crystal mentioned, feel free to drop a question that you have into the chat box when it comes up to you. She'll pass them along my way, and then we'll definitely get into all your questions. We should have plenty of time for that. So even if it's something I don't cover or don't talk about, feel free to bring it up at any point. All right, so before I talk about meat, I try to give this little disclaimer where I try to present as much stuff as fact as possible. But as a butcher, I do have some opinions on certain things. So I try to distinguish between what is, a fact, what's science, and also what is my opinion. Whenever I try to give an opinion, I try to tell you, but if you hear if it sounds like I'm, preaching to the choir or, being a little biased, feel free to ask me to clarify, and I'd be happy to do that. All right, so good meat. It is, like I mentioned, it's a little bit subjective, and it kind of comes down to the end consumer to decide what good meat is for them. As you can see by this chart, there's a few different things that sort of go into quality of meat. There is, tenderness. Is it a tender cut? Is it a fatty cut? Is it a lean cut? How fresh is it? Am I buying it directly from a farm, or, is this something that's been frozen and carted across the country to get to me? Do I care about how the animal was raised? Was the animal raised out in a field somewhere, or was the animal in a barn, with nowhere to walk around, sort of just eating and, living sort of a less than exciting life? And then, of course, there's, the environmental impact, which we're starting to learn a little bit more about in terms of how raising animals affects the environment. What are the sustainable ways to do it? What are the ways that we want to move away from? And so all those things kind of come together. And so it's important to know where your meat is coming from. And then you can sort of make that educated decision for yourself. So maybe it's, how tender is it? And I want to make sure that it is raised, close by to me. So that way I know it hasn't been vacuum sealed and frozen and transported all across the country to get to me. Or maybe you don't care about any of those things, which is totally fine. Maybe it's all price driven. Maybe, you go and you shop at the grocery store and you find whatever the cheapest cut is, because for you, that's the most important thing. That's also totally fine. But the important thing is to decide what makes good meat to you, and not necessarily what other people think good meat should be. When you go to the grocery store, a lot of times you see prime, or a lot of steakhouses will advertise prime meat or choice meat or select meat. Those are just grades that the USDA gives to meat And those grades are based only on fat. They're based on the amount of fat that you see in the end of the strip loin. Again, we'll get a little bit into anatomy as we go on, but basically, in order to get that grade, an inspector looks at one part of the steer or one part of the cow as the animal is being processed and determines whether it is prime, choice, or select. And it, like I said, it's what we call marbling. And so it's those little flecks of fat that you see in the loin of an animal. And typically there's a pretty good correlation between fat and flavor. The thing that tastes the most like whatever animal you're eating tends to be the fat. So a really fatty cut of beef will typically be a little bit more flavorful. Sometimes people choose to get a leaner cut of like lamb, for instance, because lamb fat tends to be a very strong flavor. So people who don't like the really strong lamby taste will get a leaner cut of lamb as opposed to something with a lot more fat, and vice versa. If you like that flavor, you'll get something with a little bit more fat on it. So that's when you see prime. And so typically there is a premium, because I'd 6 to 9% of, and again, this is speaking for beef, 6 to 9% of the beef that comes to market is prime. So there is much less prime beef available to the general public, and that's why it tends to be more expensive. But if fat isn't that important to you, then you don't need to buy prime meat. You can buy choice meat, you can buy select meat. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is poorer quality. It just means it doesn't have quite as much fat. So if you see choice on a menu or you see choice at the grocery store, that can still be a delicious steak. In fact, most of the meat that we sell at my butcher shop is probably choice. We don't get it graded because we buy it directly from the farmer, and then it goes to our small slaughterhouse and then comes to us. But just because it's choice doesn't mean it's good quality. I think our beef stands up with a lot of the other beef, and that's me wearing my opinion hat. Not necessarily a fact, but so yeah, it comes down to a lot of different factors. You can have a beautiful prime steer that goes to slaughter, and if it's not handled properly, if it's not processed properly, if it's not aged properly, it can be terrible. And so there isn't really one magic button or one magic way to determine what a good piece of meat is, and that goes across the board, whether it's pork, beef, lamb, poultry. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about meat itself. What is meat? Obviously, it's the muscles of different animals, usually mixed with some fat as well as some connective tissue. Typically, the fat is the white part, and then the meat is the other part, whether it's red if it's beef, or pink if it's veal, or like dark red when you're dealing with lamb. When it's poultry, it tends to be, yellow is the fat, and then sort of the opaque tan color is the actual meat. There's collagen in there, there's elastin, there's all kinds of different proteins that make up the actual muscle that keep it together. And so, as you can imagine, different muscles on different parts of the animal tend to have different levels of tenderness. In general, not always, but in general, the more work that a muscle does, the less tender it's going to be. So you can think about it where, for instance, with a steer, with a cow, they're walking around all day just eating. It's a pretty good life. And they're dipping their head down, grabbing a chunk of grass, picking their head up, chewing it, looking around, down, back for more grass, lifting their head up, looking around. So that neck meat, which we also call the chuck, tends to be really, really tough. Those muscles get used. It's the same thing. If you lift weights all day, your muscles are going to get bigger and they're going to get tougher. And the muscles that don't get used a lot, the muscles along the back, because you don't see a lot of cows, running those like zigzag courses that you see dogs running through or anything like that, because cows don't run very much. The muscles along the back don't get used a lot. They're there for structural support, but they're not, playing soccer or playing football. So they're not going to develop as big a muscle fiber, and they're not going to need as much connective tissue to hold them together. So that's generally speaking why a muscle will be tender versus not tender. There are a few, very small exceptions where there's some muscles that you can get out of the shoulder that are very tender as well, but that generally has to do with the fact that they're supported by a piece of bone, and the bone is what's bearing the brunt of the weight or the work, and not the muscle itself. So again, a lot of times people want the freshest meat possible. There's sort of a premium on fresh meat. It's hey, we got this fresh cut of meat in, or freshly cut or freshly ground, or this, that, or the other thing. Believe it or not, almost none of the meat that you eat, unless you go directly to a farm where they kill an animal in front of you and then hand you a piece of meat, is going to be truly fresh. When you kill an animal, there is a period of time after the animal's killed that the muscles need to relax. If anyone's watched an episode of Law and Order, you may have heard of the term rigor mortis, where you find a body that's all twisted around or something like that, and that has to do with the fact that because the muscles sort of lose, they're all electrically stimulated, and when they no longer are receiving electrical stimuli, they can't control themselves, so they naturally contract. And you have to give the muscles time to not, to come to relax. And a lot of times that happens through gravity. And what they'll do is they'll hang the animal up, and gravity will sort of slowly pull the muscles back apart, which will then start to relax them. You also need to go through an enzymatic process where there are certain enzymes in the meat that will actually start breaking the protein down into amino acids and a bunch of other things. And so when you eat really savory foods, Parmesan cheese, tomatoes, mushrooms, all kinds of foods like that, those are really high in glutamate, which is an amino acid that is also called umami. So that savory sense of taste that we all have. You get that in meat, and you need to, if you eat meat right away, right after it's been killed, the muscle hasn't had time to turn into those amino acids, and so it'll actually be really bland in flavor. And so at the butcher shop where I work, we dry age everything for 2 weeks for the beef. The pork hangs for a week, the lamb also hangs for a week, but because they're smaller animals, they don't need quite as much time to hang. And that's what really, that can make a huge difference. A piece of meat that is killed and processed, within a couple days of being killed, it'll eat okay, it'll be tender, but it won't have that depth of flavor that you get from aging the animal for a little bit longer. The other thing that goes into meat and the flavor is what the animal eats. And so I'm the same way. If I eat junk food and if I eat candy all day, I'm going to get big pretty quick. And that's a way that they tend to get animals to be pretty big, because beef specifically, and lamb and deer and sheep and goats, they're what are called ruminants. And so they're animals that have been designed, from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago to eat grass. They have 4 stomachs that allow them to eat the grass. And then what they do is they actually ferment the grass in their stomachs. And that's how they get the sugar or their energy out of the grass. So a cow can easily survive on grass for their whole life. But a little while ago, someone realized that if you feed them grain, that they don't have to process it as quick, or they can process it a lot more quickly. So the animals can get bigger a lot faster. And so if you can raise an animal to the same weight in half the amount of time, you're definitely going to do that. It requires way less resources, requires less water. You can get an animal out and get paid for it by selling it to a restaurant or to a butcher shop a lot faster. And so you can usually taste the difference between an animal that has been raised on corn or soy or other grain and an animal that's been grass fed. That isn't the case for pigs. Pigs are omnivores. Pigs eat pretty much whatever you give them. That's why they're happy rooting around. In Spain, they raise pigs that eat acorns all day. and that's how you get the jamon iberico, those big ham legs that you see the guys carving with the big knives. In Italy, prosciutto di Parma, the pigs are, they're fed a very specific diet, so that way they develop a certain flavor. So pigs are a little bit different. Chickens are also different. Chickens will eat pretty much anything they find. They'll eat scraps, they'll eat each other, they'll eat worms, bugs, grass, all kinds of different things. But cows, lamb, they're pretty specifically designed to eat grass. And then there's some people that have figured out a way to combine the two. So you raise the animals on grass, they develop a really nice, deep, rich flavor. And then at the end of their life, they eat a little bit of grain to sort of bulk up and add a little bit more fat to them. And that's the meat that we sell at Dixon's, which is we call it grass-fed, grain finished. There's a lot of different nomenclature out there these days about grass-fed beef, pasture-raised beef, free-range beef, all kinds of different things. And they used to sort of mean something, and now it's getting a little bit tricky because there isn't any one governing body that's deciding what grass-fed means, what grain-fed is, what all these things are. So the best thing to do is to talk to your butcher. If you're buying from a local butcher, they should know where their meat is coming from, what the animals are eating, and you can find out for yourself and sort of make that decision. I think it's kind of fun to buy a grass-fed steak, a grain-fed steak, and a grass-fed, grain-fed steak, and combine them all and see if you can taste the difference. See if it makes a difference to you, and you may find that you like one more than the other. All right. So raised right. This is where I'm going to admit a little bit of an opinion section here. I have the entire time that I've been working, I've been trying to bring in animals that are raised in the way that I deem right. That's based on pasture where they can walk around, they're not crammed in, they're not in like a dark small room. You think about where you would want to live. I don't know if you guys can see the two pictures that I have here, but you have one Highland cow in Scotland, and then you have a whole bunch of pigs in a feedlot, and you just think about where you would rather spend most of your time. And I try to think about it that way. We're going to get really quickly into the industrialization of meat. Before World War, this all happens sort of around the World War II and the New Deal. Before that, animals really dictated practices, and so you could only raise as many animals as you could fit on your your farm, your ranch, or whatever. If you had too many animals, that meant there weren't enough resources, and they'd actually die, and they wouldn't be able to survive unless there was enough space. And so ranchers kind of quickly realized what that meant and how many animals they could raise on a certain amount of acreage, and it sort of governed itself. Meat was more of a specialty item, and so I talked to my parents about it, my grandparents about it, about how meat was more of like a once a week kind of thing, where Friday night or Saturday night someone would make a roast, and that was like the big centerpiece of the week, was to eat this big piece of meat, and then you'd eat leftovers and that kind of thing throughout the rest of the week. But then very quickly, once people realized that you could feed animals grain, you could fit a lot more of them into a smaller area, meat became a lot cheaper, and it became a lot easier to produce. And then you had the rise of fast food, you had the rise of processed foods as well, where we were producing more meat than we could eat, but then we were processing it so that way it would stay good for longer. So we kind of kept producing and kept scaling up. And then we started manufacturing a lot of things. We got really good at making a lot of stuff very quickly, and that passed over into the meat industry. You have these larger scale processing plants where accidents tend to happen. I don't know if anybody read any of the stories at the beginning of COVID about how they were shutting down plants because people were in such tight quarters that it was spreading around. But a lot can happen. You look at some of these larger processing facilities, and they can process up to 800 to 1,000 head of cattle a day. The slaughterhouse that we work with can do 4. And so that gives you sort of an idea of the efficiency that we've developed when it comes to processing animals. Government subsidies also led to lower prices. You get government subsidies that make corn cheaper, and when corn is cheaper, beef becomes cheaper. And then like I said, we started to sort of really put meat as the centerpiece. And so you look at things like the Baconator, and I'll admit I've had a Baconator; they're pretty good. But we started, it was the Big Mac and the Baconator, and how much more meat can we put on a burger? And if you go to XYZ Steakhouse, it's home of the 72-ounce ribeye or something like that. And we went from less of a specialty once a week kind of thing to more of an everyday part of our life, and that's sort of where we're at now. As you can see by this map, US and a few other countries really lead the world in how much meat we eat. This is a fairly old chart. This is about 10 years old, but the numbers sort of still are around the same. And a lot of times it has to do with wealth. Typically, countries that are a little bit more developed tend to eat a lot more meat. You can also see Argentina has a huge meat culture. And so that's one of the reasons they eat a lot of meat. They have the big grassy plains that are great for raising cattle. Australia also has a really big meat culture. They have lots of space for raising it. They're really big into lamb. The Australian lamb market is like $6.5 billion a year. And unless it explicitly says that the lamb is coming from the United States, chances are it's coming from Australia. All right, as you can see, the average weight of a steer has sort of steadily increased over time, and that's just because we got better at feeding them. They got better at raising them. And so even if it's a grass-fed steer or a grain-fed steer, animals are getting bigger and bigger. And so we're getting higher and higher yields. A ribeye that you got in the turn of the century would be a lot smaller than the ribeye that you're eating now. And so, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of names out there. So you can kind of walk into any grocery store nowadays and you'll see grass-fed, you'll see pastured, you'll see free range, you'll see cage-free, organic, inorganic, antibiotic and hormone-free, GMO, uncured, all kinds of different things. And it can be really confusing. And some people also just don't care. They just say, I want a steak, just give me a steak. That's fine too. That's the easiest way to go about it. But like I mentioned, you have grass-fed versus non-grass-fed. A piece of beef that's labeled grass-fed, grass-finished is going to eat grass its entire life. So you find a lot of that coming from California, from Colorado, places where there's grass all year round. For us, the beef we get comes from New York State and a little bit from New Jersey as well. But there isn't grass to eat in New York State. We have winter here. And so if there's 2 feet of snow on the ground, it's going to be pretty hard for a steer or a cow to eat grass. The ground's going to be frozen. It's going to be, like eating a popsicle. And also the grass dies. So typically speaking, a lot of the grass-fed beef from New York tends to be finished on grain, or they eat hay, because hay is technically a grass. So you could call it grass-fed if the animal eats hay. Like I mentioned, pigs are not ruminants. They don't eat grass. They eat whatever they want. So you're never going to see a sign that says grass-fed pork. If you see somebody's trying to sell you grass-fed pork, they're lying to you. Pigs can't survive on just grass. Pastured. Pastured generally means that the animal is out walking around in a big field somewhere, usually pretty happy. Free range can mean a lot of different things. Free range can mean free range in a barn, free to roam around a barn. It can mean free to roam around a bigger cage. There's just, like I said, there's no real way to tell because there's nobody saying this is what grass-fed or this is what pastured means, this is what free range means. People just keep coming up with more and more fun adjectives to describe meat, to try and convince people that it's living a happy life. Cage-free. So cage-free just means it's not in a small cage. It can be in a bigger cage, or it can be in a small room with 100 other chickens. So cage-free, unfortunately, doesn't mean as much these days either. Organic used to mean something, but there's also, large scale industrial organic as well. Typically something is organic based on the feed that the animal is getting. It has little to do with the way of life. So you can have organic factory farmed meat as well, just happens to be eating organic grain or organic grass or organic hay. So you see a lot of times it'll say antibiotic and hormone free. It's actually illegal in the United States to give animals hormones. So when you see someone saying, hormone free, they have to. That's sort of the bottom rung. They can't be giving hormones to the animals. There's also, when it comes to antibiotics, our farmer Martin, if an animal gets sick, he'll give them antibiotics. He'll treat them, and he'll say, I rather the animal not suffer and not die, so I'm going to give them antibiotics. But there are other places that give what are called subtherapeutic, which means basically giving the animal antibiotics before they get sick. And a lot of times that's done because when animals are in very close proximity to each other, disease spreads a lot faster. So you just inject all the animals with antibiotics and then they don't get sick. So that's something to look for, is the word subtherapeutic. Like I said, they're going to give the animals antibiotics if they get sick. And again, these are all things that you need to decide if that's important to you. If if it's free range, if it's pastured, if it's grass fed, grain fed, there's a lot to take in. And so maybe you just concentrate on a couple things to start and make that the kind of meat that you eat. There isn't really a right or a wrong way to do this. There's also, non-GMO. You see that a lot of times. You see non-GMO feed, non-GMO this, non-GMO that. Again, opinion hat going on here, but there have yet to be any real studies tying GMO food to a negative impact. We've been genetically modifying food for a long time. That's why our apples taste really good, because the original apples weren't very good. So we started breeding them and crossbreeding them to get to a place where the apples, are really sweet and bright and red and delicious. And the same thing goes for a lot of the corn and things that we've been growing. We've been, original corn was like a tiny little grass, and now we have these big ears that are sweet and delicious in the summer. So, again, this comes down to something that you need to decide if you're gonna, if it's important to you, great. If it's not, also great. And then the last thing I like to talk about is uncured. There's been some talk about nitrates and nitrites. That's what we call a curing salt or pink salt. Saltpeter is another name for it. We've been using it for a really, really long time to make foods and to preserve foods. They inhibit bacterial growth, and then they also keep meat red. So when you buy a pack of bacon and it's sliced and bright red in the package, that's because it's been cured with sodium nitrate. It is an essential part of making meat taste like meat. If you were to take a ham, like ham, for instance, is a great example. If you were to take ham and which is from the leg of the pig, and if you didn't cure it with curing salt and just roasted it or boiled it or smoked it, however you wanted to do it, it wouldn't taste like ham. It would taste like roast pork, which is different. When you cure it, it adds a certain tanginess, it changes the molecular structure of the ham, it changes the texture, and it also preserves it. And so that's why ham is bright red. When you go to the deli counter and you get, a quarter pound of boar's head, it's usually bright red and not gray. And that's because of the curing salt. When you see something that says uncured, typically there's a tiny little asterisk next to uncured, and it says, except for the nitrates naturally occurring in celery salt or celery powder, or kale powder, or seaweed powder. And those are all foods that are naturally high in nitrates. And so what they do is, because they're not using like chemically derived nitrates, they're using naturally occurring nitrates, they're allowed to say that it's uncured, but your body can't tell the difference, and it's exactly the same thing. So just something to keep in mind next time you're shopping for your uncured bacon. All right, so this is a quick little chart. I know I was kind of throwing around a lot of different names of different cuts and things like that. We'll make this all available for you guys to share, but if you also Google, beef cut chart, something like this will come up. And remember when I started talking, we were talking about tenderness and why things are tender. And in general, not always, the farther from the ground the cut is, and this has to do more with four-legged animals, not really chickens, but the further from the ground you go, the more tender. And that's where the term eating high on the hog comes from, because the meat from up here on the top, so your rib, your short loin, your sirloin, your tenderloin, tends to be a lot more tender than the brisket, the shank, the plate. That's where your short ribs come from, the hind shank. And then as you go from the front of the animal towards the back of the animal, you go from leaner to fat, from fattier to leaner. So the things from the round, the rump tends to be very lean, the sirloin tends to be pretty lean, but as you go forward towards the neck, the chuck area, the brisket, the ribs, the rib eyes, those kinds of things tend to have a lot more fat to them. So if you prefer a leaner cut, you're going to want something from further back on the animal. If you like a little bit more fat, you're going to want something a little bit farther forward. A lot of times the sort of perceived juiciness that you get from a cut of meat will come not just from the water that's in the meat, but actually from the fat that's in the meat, as well as the collagen that's in the meat. So if you get a really fatty, heavily used muscle, that's why, a brisket, if you go to a barbecue restaurant, they're going to cook a brisket for 16 hours. If you were to cook a piece of top sirloin for 16 hours, it would be bone dry. It would be disgusting. It would be like eating, a bag of hay. Whereas brisket, because it has a lot of collagen and connective tissue that breaks down over time, it stays really juicy. And so that's why cuts further up on the animal, the chuck, the brisket, the shank, tend to require a lot more time. Chuck is a very classic braising stew, or, to make a pot roast or something like that. You're going to want something that can stand up to the length of cooking. All right. So now we're going to talk about cooking. There is our friend Julia Child hacking apart some chickens. She was one of the very first to bring the idea of you can eat a roast medium rare. You don't have to cook it all the way through. Like I mentioned, I was talking to my grandpa and he said all the meat he used to eat was the same color, gray. Everything was cooked all the way, super hard. And then when Julia Child started the French chef, people started to realize that you could eat meat, medium rare, medium, and it sort of started changing the way that people started to cook. So hot and fast versus low and slow. Hot and fast, as you can imagine, is things like grilling over a barbecue, or broiling, or pan frying, or pan searing, or something like that. And then low and slow is your braising. It's your slow cooking, light boil, sous vide. If any of you guys have ever messed around with that, that's where you take the meat and put it into a bag and then drop it into a controlled temperature water bath and then cook the meat very specifically that way. One of the most important things when you're cooking meat is this thing called the Maillard reaction. And that is, like I mentioned with the enzymes, where you're breaking proteins down into amino acids. The Maillard reaction is that, but hyper fast. So when you brown a piece of meat, that is the Maillard reaction. And so that's why typically when you sear something before a low and slow cook, it's going to be a lot more flavorful than if you were to just start, drop something into a pot of liquid and poach it that way. Collagen and gelatin. So those, like I said, those are the things that give you sort of perceived moisture when you're eating a piece of meat. So cuts like the chuck, the brisket, those are really full with all those kinds of things because collagen and gelatin keep the muscle together. So muscles that get used a lot more are going to have more of that collagen and gelatin. Bone broth has been like the rage for the last couple of years. And the way to make a really great beef stock is to use the knuckle bones, because the knuckle bones have the little ends of the tendons and things on them. And those tendons will break down into gelatin. And that's why a really good beef stock, when it's cold, looks like Jell-O. It'll wiggle back and forth. And that means you have a lot of gelatin in there. That's what gives it the, the feeling when it coats your tongue. That's how you get a really delicious stew. And typically in French cooking, when you make a demi-glace or you make something that has like a really rich flavor, if you go and you get like a béarnaise sauce or a steak au poivre or something like that, a lot of times they'll use a really reduced beef stock to give it that velvety texture. Other really, really important part of cooking with meat is salt. I know it sounds sort of basic and sort of simple, but adding the right amount of salt can make a huge difference to how your meat tastes and how it performs when you cook it. Salt is a tenderizer. It's also a flavor enhancer. And if you don't salt your meat or you don't put enough salt on it, it's not going to taste like anything. You can have a piece of Wagyu beef, and if you don't put any salt on it, it's still going to taste very flat. The salt tends to act as a bridge between the compounds in the meat and the flavor receptors on your tongue. And so without the salt, there's nothing, there's no bridge. And so it's just going to taste like you're eating nothing. It's a tenderizer because salt tends to break down proteins. Again, that's what we're trying to do here. So if you take a steak and, two steaks that are the same cut, 2 1-inch ribeyes, let's say, and one of them you put salt on an hour before you cook it. One of them you don't put any salt on except for right before you cook it. The one that you season an hour before is always going to be more tender than the one that you season right before you throw it on the grill. So if you can, whenever you're cooking, especially grilling, you always want to season a little bit ahead of time. It gives the salt time to work its way through so that the whole piece of meat is seasoned. And it's not just the outside where you have like a really great crust, but the inside of the meat doesn't taste like anything. Brining, I don't know if anybody here has ever brined their Thanksgiving turkey or brined a chicken or a piece of pork or anything. Brining is just dipping a piece of meat in really salty water. You can add different things to flavor it, peppercorns, coriander seed, star anise seed, bay leaves, garlic, all kinds of different things. But that's just a way of getting salt into the meat. So you make a really salty solution. And what happens is through osmosis, liquid from the meat gets pulled out and the salt actually replaces it. And so that's how you season something all the way through by brining. And it also helps with flavor because again, the more salt you have in the meat, the more it's going to taste like meat. Okay. So the do's and don'ts, the do's and don't of meat cookery. Got to change that slide. So season your meat ahead of time. I just spoke about that. The larger the piece, the more time. So if you're making a huge prime rib, say you've got like a 3-4 bone prime rib, and you're going to cook it on Saturday night for dinner for a birthday party or something like that, you're going to want to season that meat on Thursday, because Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that gives the salt time to work its way through the entire piece of meat and not just be on the outside. A big piece of meat needs time. The salt will work its way in there eventually, but it takes some time. I prefer to use kosher salt just because that's the salt that I'm familiar with. I don't think any salt is necessarily better than another salt. Some salts are more expensive, but that usually just has to do with how rare they are. So you have your Himalayan sea salt or your French sel gris or something like that. Use the salt that you're most familiar with, and that way you won't over season it. The other most important thing is to let your meat rest. That is like the biggest thing. When you cook a piece of meat, the pressure inside, as you heat something up, it increases the pressure. And so if you increase the pressure inside the meat and then you slice right into it, you're letting that pressure escape, and that's just going to force all the juices inside the meat out. So say you make that prime rib and you roast it for 4 hours or 3 hours or however long it ends up being, and it's a beautiful, you nailed it, you got it right to medium rare, it's perfect, it's beautiful. Then you're so happy to do it, you take it out to the table, you slice right into it. Everyone's going to be like, why is this dry? Why is this meat dry? And it's because you didn't let it rest. When you let it rest, the pressure equalizes, the juices redistribute, and then you'll find, again, a fun experiment you can do is go buy 2 steaks, cook them both exactly the same way, cut into one right away, and eat it. And you'll notice that it's dry. The one that you let rest for 15 minutes will be a lot more juicy, and you'll see a lot less juice on the plate. Because once you start slicing into it, the juice is going to come out of the steak and it's just going to pool. And you want all that juice still inside the steak. Learning a little bit of basic butchery. I think that's super helpful. You know, learning how to break down a chicken can be not only a rewarding experience, but it can also save you money. You can buy a better chicken if you buy it whole than if you buy boneless, skinless chicken breast, because every time someone has to touch a piece of meat, the price is going to go up. So if you're just taking the chicken from the slaughterhouse to the packing plant to you, that's way fewer steps than someone that has to take the breast off, take the skin off, you know, repack it, then do other things. So they're always going to charge you a premium for the individual cuts. So the bigger the piece of meat you can buy and then break down yourself, the cheaper it'll be. Sharpen your knives, pretty self-explanatory. A sharp knife is a safe knife. We get our knives sharpened every week at the butcher shop, because if we didn't, we would all be cutting ourselves every day, because when you have a dull knife, you have to push a lot harder on whatever it is you're cutting. And then your knife is prone to slipping off because it's so dull. So believe it or not, a sharp knife is a safe knife, and that goes for vegetables, anything in the kitchen. If you've never had your knife sharpened, it might be time. The other thing is to invest in a digital thermometer. There are ones that are $10 that you can get, you know, on Amazon, and then there are ones that are $500. I don't think anybody here needs a $500 instant read thermometer, but having one that lets you know when your meat is cooked to the right temperature takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. You know, how many times have you pulled the turkey out of the oven and it's overcooked because somewhere on some recipe you saw that it said cooked for 5 hours or cooked for 4 hours? Everybody's oven is different. Everybody's, you know, turkey is different. Brining, it affects how fast it cooks. You know, convection, how many times someone peeks into the oven is going to affect how quickly it cooks, because the temperature is going to drop. So with a thermometer, you know, there's no guesswork. So I would definitely get one. Then the quick don'ts: don't wash your poultry. You don't need to wash your poultry. You don't need, you know, even if there's a little bit of you know, liquid on the outside of it, you don't need to wash it. Washing your poultry just spreads poultry germs around your kitchen into your sink. And then if, you know, if someone doesn't realize that you were washing a chicken in the sink and they go to wash some grapes, you run the risk of getting sick. Instead, wash your hands, wash the cutting board that you were using, that kind of thing. Don't use marrow bones to make stock. That's sort of a pet peeve of mine. People come in to get marrow bones and they're just fat. They're really delicious spread on toast, but not great for making stock. Don't be afraid of raw meat. Be cautious, but you know, raw meat will not automatically kill you. Meat left out for several hours unrefrigerated, that might make you sick. But you've seen tartare, you've seen carpaccio. There are ways to eat raw meat, and you know, I eat a lot of raw meat. I'm still here, so I can endorse that. Also, don't use hot water. So if you freeze something, that's fine. Just don't use hot water to thaw it out. You'd think in your head, you know, if I use hot water, it'll make the meat thaw faster. That's actually not true. You want to use cold water, because cold water will bring the meat up a little bit more gradually. And if you use really hot water, you'll actually cook the outside of the meat while the inside stays frozen. And then that is a whole mess of foodborne illnesses that you just don't want to deal with. All right. So that was a lot of information. That was a lot of me sort of spewing information at you guys. Hopefully there are some questions. And if we want to get into those, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask now, I would be more than happy to answer them as best as I can. And then there's just a few books on here that I really enjoy, that if you're trying to learn more about meat, I highly recommend them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ted. That was a lot of information.
Yeah,
Um,
hopefully people were able to learn a thing or two.
yeah, no, I definitely did. We did have a question a little earlier. I'm not
Okay,
sure if, well, I'll read it and you can answer it, obviously. But
let's
have
see,
you ever
maybe I can.
figured out if Choice and Prime are equivalent in price if you discount how much you'd be paying for the fat that you throw out? I don't
You ever
think
figured
throw
out if
out.
choice? Oh, I can see the chat. Have you ever figured out if choice and prime are equivalent in price if you discount how much you'd be paying for the fat you throw out? So typically speaking, the fat that you get in a prime steak is not fat that you're going to be throwing out. It's the fat that's inside the muscle. And the fat that you're generally throwing out is the fat cap, the fat that's on the top of the muscle or on the outside of the muscle. And so usually there isn't a price difference when there's a big fat cap. The meat, you know, the choice or select just refers to the fat that's inside the muscle. And you never really want to throw that fat out, because that fat is what's going to help keep it nice and juicy. So how about ground beef? There's usually not a difference, in the price of ground beef. Typically, I would use, a higher fat percentage for something like burgers, and then I would use a leaner fat content ground beef for something like chili, or a soup or something like that. Because with chili, you don't want to be skimming fat off the entire time. But for a burger, you definitely want a little bit of fat in there to help keep it juicy. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a really dry burger because of how aggressively you're cooking it. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
And then a specific type of meat to use for the smoker. My husband just got one and knows nothing about it. Absolutely. So for beef, brisket is the classic one. When you go to any barbecue place, especially in Texas, that's beef country, you're going to see them smoking brisket. Brisket has the ideal combination of fat, connective tissue. If you throw a brisket that you season with salt and pepper, 50-50 salt and pepper, a lot of it, a lot more than you think you would need. Throw that onto a smoker for 12 to 14 hours, and then kind of pull it off once it's tender. You're usually going to be in a good place. And you can obsess over these kinds of things as much or as little as you want. You can get into how you clean it, do you wrap it, do you not wrap it, do you baste it? There's all kinds of things. Smoking is a very deep rabbit hole, but I would start with brisket. That's a great one. Pork shoulder is another one. Again, from a fattier, more muscle connective tissue part of the animal. Pork shoulder is great. Again, very forgiving also. If you overcook it a little bit, it's not going to dry out immediately. And if you find that it's not tender yet, you can always throw it back on the smoker. Just be prepared for things to take a little bit longer, because every smoker is different. Every piece of meat is different. And there's nothing worse than when you say, all right, everyone, we're going to eat at 6:30. And then you go to pull this, whatever it is off the smoker, and it's not even close. And then you got to, think of something really quickly. I've served a lot of barbecue at like 10:30 at night before, because my smoker wasn't holding the right temperature, and I didn't plan for the rest. That's the other thing, is if you're going to smoke something, you got to build the rest time into it. So you pull it off the smoker, you're going to wrap it in foil or wrap it in paper and let it sit for about an hour before you cut into it. Same rules apply. Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. First and foremost, thank you so much for all the information. It was
Of
awesome.
course.
And you just answered one of my questions. It was like, I just started smoking, so I want to know the rest time of it. Like if I smoke a brisket or whatever it is for however many hours, is it 50% of the time, or just let it sit for an hour in foil?
So typically it depends on your cooking setup. So if you were to go to a lot of the barbecue places in Texas, or in Long Island or New York, or wherever you go to get barbecue, typically they smoke things until they're tender. Then they take them off the smoker and they put them in a hot box. And the hot box keeps it warm, but not so warm that it continues to cook. And so that way you can pull a hot brisket out, and you can start carving it, and it'll still be hot to serve to people, but it won't keep cooking. So if you have like an igloo cooler, for instance, that's a great thing to use. And so what you do is, say you cook a brisket for 12 hours, 14 hours. If you can rest it for like 2 to 3 hours in that igloo cooler, it's still going to stay hot enough that it's safe to eat, and stay hot enough that it's delicious when you cut in, and it tastes good. But because it's not in a 200-degree smoker, it's going to stop cooking. So it's not going to overcook, but it's going to rest. It's going to give time for the muscle fibers to relax. It'll be tender. It'll be juicy. So at least an hour, but even longer if you can.
Perfect. And also, when you're brining, do you do any? Because I looked online. Did you boil it? Someone said it was like almost like making a tea, but I just did it like literally 2 days ago, and it was salt and water till it dissolved. And I put it in.
That totally works. That totally works. The only time you're going to bring something to a boil is if you're trying to infuse your brine. So, say you're using black peppercorns or something like that, or garlic, or something like that, where you actually like making a tea. If you just put tea leaves into cold water, you're not going to get
I
tea.
think.
I mean, you might get like cold brew tea where you leave it out for 24 hours or whatever like that, but the boiling is actually just to get like the essential oils and a lot of the flavor compounds out of whatever it is in your brine. And sometimes what I even do is I actually will boil a small amount of the water in the brine just to make the salt and sugar dissolve faster, then add the rest of the water cold, which cools the brine down. So that way I can then start using it right away, because you never want to brine with hot brine. Same thing, about when you're defrosting with hot water.
Yeah, hot water, I think.
Yeah, you don't want to brine with hot water. So a lot, like at work, all the brine recipes that we have are half regular water to like dissolve everything in. Then the other half of the water is actually in the form of ice. And so that way you pour the ice into the water, you end up with the right amount of water, because we do it by weight. So say it's, 1,000 grams of regular water, 1,000 grams of ice, that's 2,000 grams of water. Just one is really cold water. And so you end up with the right amount of water. But that's a really good way to make a brine. And then that way you don't have to wait for it to cool down. If you put 8 gallons of water into your fridge, it's going to take 2 days to cool.
Yeah.
And it's going to make your fridge nice and warm also. The other thing is don't sleep on dry brining. I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but a lot of times just putting some salt onto a piece of meat will do everything for you. If your brine is just salt and water, if your brine is just salt and water, skip the water. Just put salt on the meat and then save yourself the trouble. So like if you were making a brisket, you would put salt and pepper on it 24 hours before. It's going to have the same effect of brining.
That's perfect. And one
Same
more
thing
thing.
with yeah, of course.
No, go ahead. I know. Not a question. Just what's your address of your place? If I'm in the city, I'm coming to get some meat.
We're in the Chelsea Market in Manhattan.
Okay.
It's 9th Avenue between 15th and 16th Street. We're in like a big market, but we're the only butcher shop in there, so you can't miss us.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. I can't.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And then we got another question in. Is there a trick to grilling meat, especially steaks, and getting the inside cooked and not burning the outside? Definitely. So one of the big tricks with grilling meat is actually a lot of times when you go to grill meat, people say, get your barbecue as hot as humanly possible, or, preheat the barbecue for however many hours. That's great on a really thin piece of meat. If you're doing skirt steak or flank steak or something that's really nice and thin, then yes, you want to get your grill ripping hot, so that way you can sear the outside without overcooking the inside. But a lot of times with a steak that is, an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches thick, you need to be a bit more gentle. And so for things that are a little bit thicker, where you don't want to burn the outside, I will either start with a lower heat and let the heat over time cook the outside. You'll still get those great grill marks. You'll still get a nice sear on the outside. It's just going to take a little bit longer. And that gradual cooking will start to cook the meat from the inside as well. And you'll end up with a really nice sort of even cook. And then the other thing is, you ask any butcher or chef how they cook a steak. You'll, ask 10 butchers, you'll get 50 different answers about how to grill a steak. A lot of times it depends on the steak, depends on the conditions. Am I cooking over gas? Am I cooking over charcoal? Am I cooking over wood? And believe it or not, some people will say 1 turn. That's all you need to do. You cook it, sear it, flip it once, you're done. For really, really big pieces of meat, like I'm talking like, 2-3 inch cowboy steaks, I will flip it constantly. It's almost like I'm a manual rotisserie, where I'll just keep turning it and keep turning it. And so that way I get a little bit of heat on one side, then I flip it and get heat on the cold side. Then when that side starts to get hot, I flip it again. And that gradual spinning makes it so that you're cooking the steak from all different directions over a longer amount of time. And you'll end up with a really nice, beautiful, like, you won't end up with a very sort of different gradient where it's like dark and gray on the outside and then raw on the inside. It'll be all pink all the way through. So that's what I do. Then the other thing you can do is actually let your steaks come to room temperature before you cook them. So if you pull a steak that is ice cold 32 degrees, whatever temperature your refrigerator is set to, 40 degrees. You pull a steak that's 40 degrees out and you put it on a grill that's 500 degrees. The outside of the steak is instantly going to be 500 degrees, but it takes time for that heat to work its way through. So if the inside of your steak is 40 degrees and the outside of your steak is 500 degrees, you're going to burn the outside before the inside can get up to whatever temperature you want to cook it at. So typically I pull my steaks out of the fridge an hour, sometimes 2 hours before I plan on cooking them. Like I said, I was talking about salting your meat. What I'll do is I'll pull my steaks out, I'll salt them, I'll just leave them on the counter, won't even put them back in the fridge. When people come into the shop and they buy a steak for dinner that they're going to cook that night, if they come in at like 4 or 5 o'clock, I tell them don't even refrigerate it. You'd be surprised how cold a piece of meat will stay at room temperature. If you pull a steak out of the fridge, hour, 2 hours, it's probably going to only be 50, 60 degrees. It's not like it's going to be 80 degrees all of a sudden. And so that difference, that 20 degrees can be the difference between having a really nice, medium rare, medium piece of steak and something that's still like 65, 70 degrees when the outside is nice and charred. So that can help a lot as well. But I recommend, that's why that instant read thermometer is really great, because you can literally just flip a steak over and over again to make sure it's not burning, and then just poke it with your thermometer every couple minutes. And eventually you'll start to figure out a method that works really well for you. But medium fire, not a super hot fire, and instant read thermometer are the best ways to get things cooked the way you like them. Also, who cares if it's burnt? It's a little char.
Would you be able to go back to that slide, the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, of course.
And I checked our library system. We can get those books that you recommended. So if anybody's interested.
Oh, awesome. Yeah,
those
are great. So yeah, the do's and don'ts. Does anybody have any specific questions about do's and don'ts?
Let's see. She just said that she had missed a couple, so maybe she's taking notes.
Oh, okay. I know this is a little bit confusing because the things under the don't are still, it almost looks like things you should do. But I promise those are don'ts.
Is there anything you can do for like your, because I hardly ever eat leftover steak, because then you like recook it and it gets, more well done. What else can you do with steak that's left over instead of just throwing it out?
One of my favorite things to do is to make a hash. You cut up whatever steak you have left into little cubes, and then take some potatoes and onions in the morning and start sauteing the onions, and then throw the potatoes in, get those cooked, and then at the last second I'll throw the steak in and really just toss it through everything to warm it up. But I'm not trying to cook it any further. I'm just trying to get it hot again. And if you put something in, for the last 30 seconds, minute of cooking, it'll heat up so that it tastes good and it's nice to eat. But it won't overcook. It's really tough if you have like a half a steak. It's almost impossible to get it to a point where it was when it came off the barbecue. A lot of times I'll also do cold steak sandwich. That can be really nice. Like a roast beef sandwich is just a big piece of beef that you slice thinly. So if you have a steak, the other tricky thing is if you slice a steak and don't eat all the slices, it's a little bit, I would just cut them up even further and make tacos or something like that. But if you have a whole piece of steak that you didn't eat and have cold again, you'll have a better chance of heating that up. Because when the slices have more surface area, you run into some issues there, and that it'll heat up really fast and overcook.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, tacos, cold sandwiches. The only thing is if I'm eating a leftover steak cold, I'll actually trim off all the fat, because cold beef fat is not the most delicious thing. It can be kind of off-putting to eat, and it'll get stuck in your teeth and that kind of thing. So I'll trim the fat off, and then I'll just slice whatever meat I have really thinly with some pickled red onions and a little mayo. Now I'm getting hungry. It's almost dinner time. But yeah, like I said, we're in the Chelsea market. If you guys ever have questions, just give us a call, because pretty much everyone at the shop likes talking about meat as much as I do. And so even if you're not buying something from us and you call us and you have a question, or just lie to us and say, hey, I bought a steak from you and I have a question about it, we won't know the difference. You're more than welcome to call us and ask us our opinion on how to cook something, or anything. We're happy to chat about. If you ever want to email me, it's ted@dixonsfarmstand.com. Pretty straightforward. Here, I will actually write that. ted@dixonsfarmstand.com. That's my email address. I just sent it out. Oh, I sent it just to PJ. Sorry, PJ. Everyone. There we go.
That's okay. I don't blame you.
There we go. I sent it to everyone. That is my email address. Feel free to email me with your meat related questions, meat cooking related questions. Beyond that, I don't have a lot of expertise, so I wouldn't email me about much else. But feel free to send me a message. I can also send, if you email me, I can send you this presentation. Or if you have other questions, places, resources, things that you want more of, I'd be more than happy to help you find whatever information you need. Yeah, that's the phone number at the shop that just got dropped into the chat. That's a good one too. You can always ask for me. I'm there a lot of the days of the week, and always happy to answer any questions. Does anyone have any other questions before we end this evening?
No questions, but thank you. This was awesome.
Awesome. Great. I'm so happy. Hopefully everyone learned a thing or two. We're getting into grilling season. I mean, Memorial Day is right around the corner. Hope everyone has great summers. Hope everyone is doing okay, and gonna start enjoying the outdoors here pretty soon. I'm excited to be outside and get out of my apartment.
Awesome. Thank you so much again, Ten. Again, I said earlier the presentation was recorded, so if you want to watch any of it again in a couple of days on our YouTube channel, it should be there. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye, everybody.